All right. Today we are on our last lecture for Com 303, Com theory. Today we're talking about feminist standpoint theory. I get more into detail on like general feminist theory in some other classes. Today we're not going to cover it too in depth, but we're going to just get some of the main concepts that are going to be necessary for your final exam up here. And then, as mentioned with the muted group theory situation on the last video, if the exam is posted, if you kind of look it over a little bit, you'll know what you need to catch in order to figure out, where you need to study and what you need to elaborate on. So take that into consideration. Some of the basic assumptions of just feminism in general, excuse me, is ending gender-based oppression. So making sure that everybody has equal opportunities regardless of their biological sex, all right, regardless of how they express themselves or sort of like live their life, right? So this does fall under sort of more modern interpretations, deals with issues within the LGBT community, etc., right? So yeah, just ending, barriers for people based on their gender, based on their sex, based on sexual orientation, etc., right? Equality under the law. Feminism is rooted in Marxism. It is a neo-Marxist theory. We've talked about Marxism. Marxism at first it deals with issues of class, right? So there's the proletariat, there are the masses, there are the bourgeoisie, the sort of small group of individuals at the top that control everything, right? Marx was trying to figure out a way to flatten that hierarchy, right, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Neo-Marxist theories took the ideas of Marx and said that there are other ways in which people are not given equal access to, fully live within society, that are more than just class. So feminism assumes that the ways in which the world was set up, or they might even say today, still set up, is based on men at the top of the hierarchy, women at the bottom of the hierarchy. Critical race theory is a neo-Marxist theory. Queer studies is a neo-Marxist theory, right? So any theory that generally deals with identities or talking about how some identities have privilege and some are oppressed are neo-Marxist theories, all right? I have assumptions, I have opinions on these. I'll set those to the side for now, but that's more or less what that neo-Marxist theories are, all right? Feminism is a neo-Marxist theory, okay? Now, what gets complicated, and we'll talk about sort of essentialism here in a moment, there are these interesting sort of debatable assumptions within feminism, right? So for instance, can you be pro-life and a feminist? So you do get in this question of like who gets to decide like on various policy specific aspects that sort of get placed under the feminism policy umbrella. Yeah, who gets to decide what policies are feminist or not feminist, or whether or not those policies should even be a factor in the debate. All right. So if we just have these basic assumptions that says, look, people should be treated equally under the law, people should have equal access to, second wave feminism in the 1960s, 1970s was women should have equal access to educational facilities. So this is where we get into things like Title IX. Women should have equal access to the workplace. So this is when we get into policies like affirmative action policies. All right. Just making sure everyone has equal access to show their merit and compete on a level playing field. And then, some people are going to win, some people are going to lose, some people are going to succeed, some people aren't going to succeed, right? But as long as people have the barrier of entry is equal for everyone, this is kind of where we start, right? When we get into these, sort of debatable policy by policy things, it gets a little bit complicated. It gets a little bit ugly, as some of the infighting, we'll call it. And I'll give you some examples later, specifically around this idea of like whether or not a person who's pro-life can also be a part of like a feminist organization. As of a couple of years ago, the general answer was no, and I think that's unfortunate if you're trying to, cast a big tent to make sure that you're inclusive. But these are some interesting assumptions. A few years back, there was some questions about, there was people who were very vocal feminists, who, the issue of gay marriage was in front of the Supreme Court. And so the questions came down. I was like, okay, you have all these like sort of old school second wave feminists, 1960s, 1970s. Um, what if some of those individuals were supportive of traditional marriage and didn't support, let's say, same-sex marriage, right? Did they still get to be a part of the group, right? Can you vote Republican ever, right? And consider yourself a feminist, right? Obviously, we're a very polarized country. Obviously, there are plenty of women who are Republican. Um, one of the sort of most solid voting bases for the Republican Party is married women. Women who are married are far more likely to vote Republican than single women. So obviously there are women who vote Republican, and if it's like let's have equal opportunities for everybody and let's make sure everybody can make whatever choice they want to. Well, you have to realize like some women are going to make choices that sort of like the leaders of feminism aren't going to agree with. Um, and therefore, you have this question of whether or not they get the protections, or if they're gonna, if sort of feminist movements are also going to include them in the conversations. All right, we'll kind of leave it at that. All right. So standpoint theory, all right. Standpoint theory. Let's think of it very literal for a moment. All right. So if we're in the classroom, we do this exercise where I, as a professor, physically stand at the front of the room and I try to describe the room. All right. I am going to describe what the room looks like. And my description of the room might say, okay, in front of me there's a window. I can see 5 students, and the student in the middle is wearing a red hat. In front of me, on the left-hand side of the wall, there's a motivational poster, whatever. All right. And that description of the room is accurate. All right. Now, then I would get a student who's on the other side of the room. I'd have that student stand up. And that student would describe the classroom. And that student would say, I don't see a window anywhere in this classroom, but I do see a chalkboard. And in front of me, I see 3 students. One of them has a black backpack, but nobody is wearing a hat. And to the right-hand side of me, I see a poster. All right. Both the descriptions of the room are correct. All right. And both of those descriptions of the room have to do with physically where we are standing in the room. All right. So what standpoint theory says is that where you stand, right, influences how you see the world. Now, in the classroom exercise, it's where do I physically stand in the room is going to influence how I see the world. Standpoint theory gets metaphorical, right? Where you are in the world, right? Your experiences shape how you see the world. Your age, your race, your sex, your sexuality, your parents, your background. All these things shape where you metaphorically stand in the world. And so your view of the world is going to be different than my view of the world based on where we stand. All right? So people with different experiences see the world differently. This is true. All right? This makes sense. All right? So for this part of standpoint theory, I think they get it right. All right? Where I stand in the world influences how I see the world. Now, this is where I think feminist standpoint theory goes too far. All right? A person who takes an interpretivist approach is going to say, look, this is how I see the world. But I understand that my biases, my background, clouds my judgment. But I still think that there's an objective truth to what the world is. So I stand in the classroom, I describe it, but I recognize that I have biases based on where I'm physically located in the world. So my description is going to be based on where I'm physically located. The student on the other side of the classroom, they describe the classroom, but they have biases based on where they're standing in the classroom, right? But both of us together say, look, I have a perspective, you have a perspective, but there is still an objective classroom here that both of us are getting close to accurately describing, right? But we can't quite get there because our biases are clouding our judgment. But we both still believe there's an objective, concrete classroom in front of us. And we're just trying to get closer and closer and closer to describing it with 100% accuracy, right? By and large, it's the scientific method, right? we're trying to get closer and closer and closer to describing the world as accurately as possible. We keep reflecting back and saying, I have some biases, I have some prejudice, I have some background stuff that is clouding my judgment, but we're both trying to describe the objective world that exists in front of us, all right? That's a positivist view, all right? There is a true world out there. We are both trying to describe it accurately, but biases cloud our judgment. Standpoint theory, right? This is where they go off the rails. They say, no, there is no objective classroom. There is only the classroom that we interpret, and everybody's interpretation is true for them, right? And so at the end of it, if I have a perspective and someone else has a perspective, both those perspectives can be accurate, but both those perspectives might be in conflict with one another. There's only subjectivity. The only thing that exists is our subjective interpretation of the world around us, right? This is a post-positivist view, right? After positivism, right? It's also sometimes referred as postmodernism, right? But all this means is that we go into the world, we describe the world, and that description is true, and it's as true as it's going to be. Subjectivity is the only thing that exists. There is no objective classroom without our interpretation of it. Subjectivity is the end all be all, right? Now, this is where you can start to have some friction. So let's say that you and I are describing the classroom, and let's say that you do a poor job describing the color of the wall, right? And let's say all the walls are the same colors, right? It's all a nice, beige, right? But you say that they're purple, right? I say they're beige, you say they're purple. A positivist, people who are both positivists, get involved in a debate to try to figure out what are the true, capital T, true objective colors of the wall in the classroom. A post-positivist says, no, like Josh, your interpretation is they're beige, so-and-so's interpretation is that they're purple. That is both of those experiences are true for each of you subjectively, and therefore both those answers can be correct. So there's no reason for you two to debate, or if you're going to debate, the only way to debate is for one of us to, it becomes this power struggle over whose interpretation is going to win out, as opposed to the objective reality of the situation should win out. All right, it shouldn't be about who can debate the best. It should be about who can sort of bring forth the evidence that actually supports their claim. All right. So post-positivist is rooted in subjectivity. Subjectivity is the only thing that matters. It's the only thing that's real. Positivists say, no, there's an objective reality. Our prejudice, our biases cloud us being able to see objectivity accurately, but we still think that there's an objective reality out there. All right. We won't worry about social constructionism and deconstruction here in a second, but let's talk about the limitation generally in standpoint theory, right? So you get this place where you say, look, if everyone's truth is legitimate, then nothing is ultimately true, right? It just becomes a struggle over who has the best story to tell, who can tell the best story and convince the most people that they're right. So you go back to someone like Socrates, right? This is where Socrates gets really skeptical of these elocutionary teachers, right? These teachers of public speaking, these teachers of public debate. Because Socrates wasn't concerned about debating in order to win, right? Whose interpretation wins, who can win the most people to their side of the argument. Socrates was concerned about people should be in conversation, not debating, but in conversation with each other in order to figure out what is ultimately true about the situation, right? The person who wins the debate shouldn't be the person who just persuades more people over to his side. The person who wins the debate is the person who gets closer to the truth, right? The objective truth, right? And so, yeah, I mean, if everybody just gets to have their own version of reality and it's all subjective, then everything is subjective, right? There is no objectivity that we're all striving for, all right? If you get to go through life and just say, well, this is my interpretation, that's your interpretation, let's agree to disagree, and you say that on everything, then we're going to have no commonality, specifically when it comes to academic research methods to try to figure out what is true about the world around us. All right. If we all just get to sort of say like, well, my experience tells me, this is some of the stuff in like research methods we talked about, like the problems with autoethnographic research. If I just get to go around and say, well, this is how I feel, this is what I experience. It's interesting, right? But your experiences don't necessarily make objective reality. All right. So here's a quote by the late philosopher. He died a little over a year ago, last January 2020. Roger Scruton. You can look up some of his stuff. We watched him with the not in this class, but another class when we Why Beauty Matters. He's the narrator. All right. So he has this quote where he just sort of puts this whole like postmodern debate to bed, where he says, look, a writer who says that there are no truths or that all truths are merely relative is asking you not to believe him, so don't. Right? So what he's saying is that someone who comes in and just says like, look, everybody's interpretation is correct, everything is subjective, right? There are no ultimate truths out there. Truth is just this relative thing based on your standing in the world at the moment. That person is just asking you not to believe their interpretation because their interpretation is just as wrong as everybody else's. So he's like, well, then just don't believe their interpretation, right? You should be arguing for an objective version of events, an objective version of how the world works, right? People's evidence is going to be in conflict, but we should be in the exercise of debating it in order to figure out what is actually true about this situation, as opposed to saying, here's my interpretation of the world, it's subjective, here's your interpretation of the world, let's agree to disagree. Well, if those two versions of the world are in direct conflict with one another, they both can't be true. All right? So that's the biggest limitation of standpoint theory. All right? Yes, we interpret the standpoint theory gets this correct. I interpret the world differently than you based on my background, my biases, my judgment is always clouded based on my experiences, and so is yours. Standpoint theory goes too far when they say, but that's okay, right? Like the whole world is just subjective. So it's not that your judgment is being clouded, it's that that's your version of events and that's your truth, and I can have my truth, and so, Jim can have Jim's truth, right? No, there should only be the truth, right? There's only one version of things that are objectively true. We should all be working together to figure out what is that objectively true thing, as opposed to just saying we all have our own version of what the classroom looks like and they're all 100% accurate. They're not all 100% accurate, all right? But that's what standpoint theory is asking us to believe, is that everybody's version of reality is 100% accurate, and the only thing that exists is subjectivity, all right? Okay, there you go. Let's move along here. We talked a couple slides ago. I said we're going to come back to like the pro-life and feminism and whether it can exist or not. This kind of came to a head during the Women's March right after Donald Trump was sworn into office. So it would have been January 2017. There was a Women's March. A lot of different organizations for women, supported by women, came to D.C. There was one organization in particular and these were organizations that didn't like Donald Trump. There was one organization in particular that came and said, we don't like Donald Trump either, but they were pro-life. And they were sort of this like lefty pro-life organization, right? Which is kind of like a rare thing. Back in the 80s, even you have like Bill Clinton in office in the 90s, there were still a lot of like pro-life Democrats. I don't know if those individuals or organizations, I'm sure the individuals exist, but organizations that don't exist too much anymore. But there was an organization that supported the Women's March. They helped put it together, and then the last minute someone was like, oh, this organization is pro-life, so they're against abortion, and they kicked them out of the Women's March. They said, you can't be on our flyers anymore. We're not going to tell everybody that you helped to raise money to support the Women's March in D.C. All right. So this becomes a problem with essentialism. All right. So essentialism is the idea, that all people who identify as blank must believe blank. All right. You're essentializing a person's identity. So, for instance, we can talk about political voting blocks, which I find super offensive and condescending. All right. So when someone gets on the news and say, this is what women want X, right? That's essentializing women, right? So in one regard, we're saying like, don't stereotype people, right? But then, and the next sentence out of someone's mouth will be like, but we know how all these people think because they all vote a certain way. And if you don't vote a certain way, you're not a real whatever, right? If you don't agree with this particular policy, you're not a real woman. If you're not pro-choice, you're not a real woman. You don't kind of get to, you don't get the protections of, feminist organizations. All right. Yeah. So someone will say like, look, like, and again, I think this is super offensive and condescending, but when people say things like, all African Americans are different, don't stereotype, you can't stereotype, but then in the next breath they'll come on and be like, the African American community wants X. And you're like, there's 40 million African Americans. Like, I don't think they all want the same thing. All right. The working class, don't treat them all the same. Like, they're different. There's diversity amongst them. Don't act like they all vote the same. Don't stereotype them. Oh, by the way, the working class wants X. And you're like, okay, that's what essentialism is. I mean, it's essentially, essentially. It's stereotyping in some regards, right? But it's stereotyping to the extent of, back to this last statement, like, if you don't agree with this particular policy, it's like you're not real enough, you're not authentic enough, right? You're not woman enough, you're not a feminist enough if you disagree on one or two policies. You're not black enough if you disagree with certain tenets of, let's say, Black Lives Matter. You're not Hispanic enough if you disagree with certain immigration policies. You can't hang out in certain groups. You're going to be disowned. You're going to be called various names that people would label you. If you are like a traitor to your gender, your race, your nationality, your working class backgrounds, what have you. All right, that's what essentialism is. It's coming in and acting as if everybody within that group thinks the same way, and then when people don't fall in line, you say mean, nasty things about them to the point of saying like they aren't real, right? They actually they're actually not a part of that group at all, right? Okay, I'll end there. The Matrix of Domination was created by this scholar named Patricia L. Collins. I'll show you this on the next slide. But what the Matrix of Domination says is that there's different forms of oppression that everyone can experience. So this gets into some problems, and I'll show you the problem on the next slide. So this is an example of one of the Matrix of Dominations. The big problem with this is like we continue to add more and more identifying categories to people. So for instance, Patricia O'Connell says, look, so this gets into things like Black feminist thought, all right, which is another theory. So back in the day, second wave feminism, they said, look, gender's this issue, right? And men are closer to the center. The closer you are to the center, the more privilege you have, right? And women are on the outside, right? Black feminist thought came in and said, look, like, Black women are sort of doubly oppressed because even though, so not only do they have to, not only are Black women subjugated by men, but they're also subjugated by race. All right. So if you're white, you're closer to the center. If you're a man, you're closer to the center. If you're Black, you're out here. But let's say you're Black, but you're a man. So you have a little bit of oppression here, but you have some privilege over here, right? And let's say you're young, right? So you're a young Black man. So now you have like 2 privilege things and 1 oppression thing. But you're disabled, right? So now you have another oppression. Like, so you see how ridiculous this starts to get after a while, all right? But this is the Patricia Collins starts this idea known as the Matrix of Domination. People keep adding to it because there are a whole lot of categories that people said aren't represented. So on this one particular, we don't see nationality, right? So with all of the talk about immigration in the last few years, someone, I'm sure somewhere someone has said like, hey, hold on a second, like immigration status should be on this wheel, right? Because there are some people who pass for white, they're men, they're heterosexual, but they are immigrants, right? So they're oppressed out here on like the on the immigrant side of the scale. All right. So that's what the matrix of domination looks like. It just starts to ask you a long list of questions with regard to your identity, and then some of them have privilege, and some of them have, some of those identities are oppressed. The problem with this whole model, right, is that when you start to play this game, all of a sudden you start realizing that everybody has privileges and everybody is marginalized. And if everybody is marginalized, then nobody's marginalized, right? If everybody gets to have some sort of claim to marginalization, then there's no more point of talking about marginalization, or there's no more point in making policies that address historic wrongdoings because of marginalization, because all of a sudden everybody gets to claim something on their little affirmative action form. All right, so let's see what this looks like. So affirmative action, EEOC, which is like your employment, protection, make sure that you're not being discriminated against in employment kind of stuff, right? In the 1960s, 1970s, when we were first starting to talk about affirmative action, we actually were just talking about the issues of race, all right? So it's coming out of the civil rights movement. Affirmative action is coming out of the civil rights movement. Right before affirmative action sort of gets put into mainstream culture as far as policy, second wave feminism comes up and says, hold on a second. Not only have people of various racial backgrounds been discriminated against in the workplace, but women have also been discriminated against in the workplace. So people are like, okay. So we'll allow you to make some sort of affirmative action claim based on your race. And also, if you're a woman, you can check a box that says, I'm a woman, I'm from a historically marginalized group. Fair enough. All right. Then in the early 1990s, another group came forward, and this group said, we've also been discriminated against. Right? And this is when we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. Right? So you're like, okay. So now the affirmative action form's getting a little bit longer, and people can start to claim, okay, maybe I am white, so I'm of a privileged racial group. Maybe I'm a man, right? But I have a disability, right? So I get to claim that disability status. Later on, we're starting to do things with veteran status. So veterans, specifically some of the stuff that was going on after the Vietnam War, veterans started to get discriminated against in the workplace. So if you're a veteran, you get protection. Gender identity with regard to how you express yourself, right? If you're a transgender person, now you get protected, right? People of certain your age, you can't discriminate based on age, based on size, based on class status, based on religion, based on political beliefs, right? So as you see, like as this form gets longer and longer and longer, what you realize is that originally it was, look, African Americans in the aftermath of the civil rights movement had been marginalized out of the workforce, right? And we need some moment in time where we can't just say civil rights are passed, now everybody's equal. We say, look, civil rights are passed, and there's going to be this buffer period to sort of get everybody caught up, right? So we can truly operate on equal playing field. So we're going to make sure that affirmative action is applying to African Americans, right? The more ways in which you allow people to claim a oppressed status, then all of a sudden what happens is everybody is elbowing each other out of the way in order to claim at least one oppressed, marginalized status on a form so that they can't be discriminated against. All right? So I'll give myself an example. I'm a white, heterosexual male, all right, with a, PhD. But guess what? I come from a lower class, blue collar family. Can I claim some sort of class status issue on a form to make sure that I'm getting a leg up in a hiring process because I don't come from money? All right. That's a question that people are trying to ask and answer, right? So for instance, Michael Jordan, you all know Michael Jordan. Michael Jordan has some kids, right? So Michael Jordan's kids are African American, right? So they say, look, here's a box I can check, but I can say, look, Michael Jordan wasn't my dad. My dad didn't have millions of dollars in an NBA contract. Now we're both vying for a slot at a university with regard to the admissions process. If both of us check some sort of box that says we're from a historically marginalized group, which one of us gets a seat in that classroom at that university? So this becomes this weird, the matrix of domination becomes this weird struggle where people are trying to showcase small ways in which they might have been marginalized in order to make sure that they don't lose out on opportunities. All right. When this was all dreamed up again in the 1960s, 1970s, understandably legitimate reasons with regard to the aftermath of the civil rights movement and the ways in which you can't just tell an entire group of people, look, we've treated you like garbage for 250, 300 years, right? And now everything's equal in the law, so like just figure it out. That's not reasonable, all right? So you deal with affirmative action on issues of race. The more groups you add to protected classes, the more race becomes not as important with regard to an employer, right? So if an employer can come in and say, there's like 5 final candidates, and let's say the employer hires a white person, people come out and say, look, like your boardroom's not diverse enough. Well, we've expanded what diversity means because the person we hired was actually a woman, or the person we hired has a disability, or the person we hired is a veteran, right? So there's all these like weird little loopholes that employers get away with, or university administration gets away with regard to like, look, if we make enough historically marginalized groups, everybody's going to fit into one of these groups at some point. So when you have this sort of exhausted list of some ways you're privileged, some ways you're oppressed, at some point you have to look at this list and say, there's no point of even having this list anymore. There's no reason to go through this weird calculation. We might as well just take the list, crumble it up, and throw it in the garbage, because we've sort of proved the point that some people have identities that are historically marginalized, and those same individuals have some identities that are historically privileged, right? So if all of us are a little bit privileged and a little bit oppressed in various ways, there's no more reason to try to like calculate and social engineer this. So we start placing people in different universities or different classrooms or different jobs based on identity status, when at the end of the day, everybody has some hardships, everybody has some ways in which they're advantaged. And so what's the point of like counting all these sort of marginalized identities anymore? All right. So that's where this thing becomes extremely complicated. Okay, back in the 1960s and 1970s, it made sense to say, look, African Americans have not been included in universities and the workforce hiring process the ways they should be. If they're qualified, they deserve an interview, they deserve to get a job, they deserve to be in the classrooms at these universities, right? That was like one identity to say, that made it easy, right? The more complicated you make this process, the more we start slicing and dicing people's identities to ask for 50 different ways a person identifies, race, gender, disability, veteran status, on and on and on and on, right? All of a sudden it becomes this complicated matrix of, we might as well just take this entire piece of paper, crumble it up, and throw it in the garbage, because this is not a useful way to social engineer, our universities, our workforce, etc. Right? If you want to be very targeted and say, look, this business has a history of not employing women, okay, go out and recruit women, right? But as soon as you make this long list of all the ways in which everybody can claim some sort of marginalized status, there's just no use in going through this exercise. All right. Okay. That's feminist standpoint theory. That's the end of the class. Take your exam, turn it in. I'll see you all hopefully in the fall, in person, without the COVID stuff. All right. See you later.